Victoria 3 has been on what I'd call an impressive reign of terror over the Paradox community. What I mean by that, of course, is that Victoria 3 is killing it. Not to say, of course, that the DLCs have been perfect. The bane of Victoria 3's DLCs in the past year have been bugs, and this is always the unfortunate thing about making a review before the DLC is publicly available. I can never be sure what bugs I find will stay in the game or not. Rest assured, guys, when I find them, I report them, and boy do I report them. But let's rip the band-aid off. Iberian Twilight has some bugs. Nothing too bad in the sense that I fully expect it to be fixed for release, or at least shortly thereafter, but they're there, and I don't know if any of you will see them or not. The biggest one is that modifiers to infamy based on the target being unrecognized simply aren't applying right now. In fact, none of the infamy modifiers are applying right now. The treaty option to try and get a personal union on Brazil as Portugal is currently very iffy, although sometimes functional. Some events are missing targets or localization. Businesses will continue to hire pops even if they're not profitable, blah blah. Look, I wanted to get this talk about bugs out of the way immediately because National Awakening had bugs. Charters of Commerce had bugs, and we're all used to that conversation. I want you to quickly consider, if you've been playing Victoria 3, how you feel about these DLCs just on the merits of their content after the major bugs have been fixed. That is the far more important metric, but I also want to be clear that buggy releases are not okay and they should be shamed. Nonetheless, I want to basically preface this review by saying that I'm going to assume most of the biggest bugs are fixed when I make this review, because otherwise it would just be, yeah, there are bugs, and that drags the game down. The DLC is obviously more than just is it buggy or is it not buggy, so we'll more or less be sweeping bugs aside to instead talk about the actual content of the DLC and the new patch. With that, we have to address the second elephant in this increasingly small room. Iberian Twilight is a follow-up to two pretty damn good DLCs. To me, National Awakening had a few missteps, but overall was extremely well done. Charters of Commerce was a beautiful revival of the entire game, I'd say, and then there's Iberian Twilight. Iberian Twilight is just sort of okay. Yeah, I'm a little lukewarm on it. It should be said that I'm not particularly interested in most journal content. I tend to just play on my own game in Victoria 3, but National Awakening had interesting enough journals that I genuinely enjoyed pursuing them, unlike every other DLC in the past. That said, Iberian Twilight feels lacking compared to National Awakening, and keep in mind I really liked National Awakening, so that means that in comparison, Iberian Twilight might feel worse, but it's still probably pretty good by most people's metrics. Let's get into why I feel that way. I did two full, well, nearly full campaigns for this DLC. One is Portugal and one is Spain, which allowed me to experience nearly all of the available content, and I also did several small playthroughs as Cuba, the Philippines, and the United States, so I could get a taste of the more minor flavor in the free update, and then via the United States, a playthrough as a nation with no new flavor to see how the new mechanics affect the game in isolation. I think I got a pretty good breadth of experience from all these playthroughs, so I feel pretty confident in how I feel about this DLC. Let's get into it. What I just said there about experiencing everything the DLC has to offer with two playthroughs is one of my first complaints. Spain and Portugal have content, but that's about where it ends. No Navarra content, no Catalonia content, and like, okay, fine, those are releasables and basically no one would play them anyway, but I would have been quite pleased to see Andalusia get some kind of Reconquista content or something, you know? An Andalusian revival, even if historically basically impossible, is still interesting and worthy content in my opinion. It's true basically no one would play it since it'd be so obscure, but still, I like stuff like that when it's there. National Awakening had Bulgaria with at least some content, even though they don't exist on GameStart. Regardless, there's also Carlist Spain, but it should be noted that Carlist Spain, upon defeating Bourbon Spain, just adopts all the content that Bourbon Spain would otherwise have. So it's more something that you choose if you want an alternate history with a different dynasty leading the nation. This leads me to another problem, the ideologies. First of all, the two pretender dynasties and their ideologies in Portugal and Spain are identical, literally. Carlists and Miguelists are radically conservative and on account of that, entirely useless. They want traditionalism, they want subjecthood, they want autocracy and other lackluster laws. They're comparable to the Legitimists of France, which are also a useless ideology, and I'm willing to accept that these guys are, in essence, just for roleplay. Legitimists, Carlists, and Miguelists are ways to roleplay a return to a hyper-conservative monarchy which rejects modernity. However, Victoria 3 doesn't have any incentives or reasons to ever be conservative, so you'll never see me interested in a playthrough as one of those ideologies. That's okay for France because the Legitimists can instead act as a sort of antagonist of your modernizing Orleanist or Bonapartist rulership. With Iberia, we have Carlist Spain as an actual tag to play. This is false content. The Carlists are just Spain, but you have to fight to earn it, and then you have a terrible ideology in charge. What it does give you, which isn't a meme, is a bunch of progress towards solving two Spain's journal entry. However, with how that JE works right now, it's more or less impossible to actually resolve for either side. I did everything I could to get a conservative victory in some testing before the review, including the dreaded general spam for clout, winning a civil war, and just doing anything possible to push the conservatives to victory, to the point of marginalizing every interest group that wasn't Carlist and ruining my nation with awful laws, and it still won't push to the required 90% to end. In my actual Spain playthrough, I ended up losing the journal when I formed Iberia, which is not a satisfying ending to say the very least. There's nothing more frustrating than a journal you can't complete, and I suspect the numbers will be tweaked either for release or for a patch in the first week or two. A lot of the journals in this DLC feel that way. They feel unrewarding, not particularly satisfying, or at best, janky. The one I liked the most was the journal to reconquer the old Spanish Empire, which has a fun little challenge in it. If you can pull it off before 1880, the modifier it would grant you for 10 years is instead granted for the rest of the game. That sort of thing is pretty fun, and I pulled it off without too much trouble in my playthrough. I won't comment on how easy or hard it is, as you know I'm kind of a GIGACHAD myself, but I found it to be quite laughably easy to achieve, and I could have actually done it around the 1850s if Brazil didn't conquer Bolivia before I could and then ally the United States. That aside, Spain has a couple other journal entries, like the Regeneration, where you do a bunch of tasks which are, again, not very hard, but if you're not as good at the game, maybe they're tough. I like the dynamism of these journals, as you can basically take reduced rewards in return for easing the requirements on them. That's a very good mechanic, very fun and very appreciated. I do want more of that, and I think it's a solid idea. With that, let's move on to some of Portugal's content now. Portugal's main content paths concern Brazil, Africa, and its own regeneration, akin to Spain's, but without the cool mechanics for reducing the requirements on the journals. This content is okay, but again kind of flat. Pursuing the Brazil journal sees you making a union, and then eventually being able to give Brazil Portuguese culture, or give Brazilian culture a unique cultural trait which, hilariously, Portuguese does not have, meaning it doesn't actually increase acceptance. Looks like Paradox forgot to give Portuguese culture the Lusitanian trait. Very funny. I'm gonna assume that'll be fixed for release, by the way. It's just a simple fix, and I did report it, so pretty sure that'll be fixed. It feels like getting the union with Brazil should be the midpoint of the content, but instead, it's the end. Kind of lame. Once you actually have the union, you get to choose between adding Lusitanian or just giving Brazil Portuguese culture, and that's the end of all Portugal content about Brazil. It's just not enough. That feels like that's the midpoint. Portugal's Mozambique and Angola content is, again, just really lame. You connect the east and west coast, complete the pink map, and that's it. In this case, maybe it's okay because it takes a long time to colonize the center of Africa thanks to malaria, but it still feels underwhelming to have a journal whose entire purpose is to sit and wait for malaria prevention, then to sit and wait for colonial growth. I'm trying to think of how to explain why this stuff is lame, but National Awakening's content for Austria was good. I think it's because the various rewards and paths to pursue for Austria were first of all more numerous, and secondly more interesting in terms of achieving them. See, colonizing Angola and Mozambique as Portugal is as simple as waiting until you complete the colonies. Getting the Brazil PU is simple as getting the treaty with Brazil, hoping they don't break the treaty before Pedro dies, and then you're done. Even Portugal's Devorismo journal, which to start the game with, is simply an early game debuff. Keep taxes high, ride out the bad modifiers, escape debt, and then resume your normal game. It's not that it's too easy, it's that the solution is too simple to enact and lacks long-term consequences. It's more like a road bump than an actual obstacle. Austria's choices on its path to figuring out its various minorities could see you gaining a bunch of primary cultures, or fighting civil wars, or maybe embracing neo-absolutism, which, by the way, is an example of giving conservative ideology something worth striving for, unlike with the Carlists, but I digress. Austria's Metternich journal is much more interesting to pursue on its own than anything Iberian Twilight has to offer, and that's because achieving the requirements to succeed in the Age of Metternich require you to alter your play in an interesting way. Although I had critiques for the Grundzeit in National Awakening, it was an interesting journal to pursue in that it really made you play the game. Iberian Twilight really flounders in that sense, and for that reason I've got to summarize this DLC's journal content as quite lackluster. It would be more forgivable if this DLC came out in the same era as Voice of the People, which gave content to France. I can understand when a game is kind of learning its footing and trying to keep things simple, that its content will reflect that simplicity. France's journals were not particularly complex nor high in quality, which we can see reflected in that DLC's review scores, nice. But after a series of well-done journals like in National Awakening, this feels like a huge step down. The journals for Cuba were, in my opinion, very simple but serviceable for what they were. It's interesting, despite the Cuba journals definitely feeling small in scope and less impactful than Spain's or Portugal's, I found myself satisfied with them because they set a reasonable expectation that I then achieved and felt happy about. Sometimes expectations can inform the quality of your experience far more than the actual impact of that experience. Oh, and I have to talk about Esperanto real quick now. Those that know me know that I am a linguist, and therefore the inclusion of Esperanto in the game is of course very cool. Basically, communist Spain can, when trying to form Iberia, adopt Esperanto language and gain a new culture called Iberian. That's it. That's all. Not really anything going on there. Historically, the idea behind Esperanto was to be a universal language to bridge the gap in communication for humanity. Given the idea behind the language, you'd think there'd be a system, perhaps, for spreading the language to new cultures and working to get Esperanto some kind of support in the world, so it can maybe actually become the world's language. Alas, much like all the journals in this DLC, it ends right when you think it's just getting started. Expectations killed Esperanto for me, and I will add that this could be my personal bias as a language nerd, and that for most people, it won't be disappointing that there's so little Esperanto content. Anyway, that's the DLC content beyond the peripheral stuff like new historical characters and new art. Of course, new characters and new art will always be appreciated. Where I'm disappointed is with the new companies. There are 10 new companies coming with this DLC, which is the same as what came with National Awakening, and yet the companies we get are just sort of boring and there's a lot of overlap between them. The ones I'm happy to see are the Portuguese and Spanish companies that give new prestige wines. Previously, only France with Champagne had a prestige wine, but now at least the Iberians can get a prestige wine. There's also now a prestige sugar and another prestige liquor, which again are positive, but the prosperity bonuses on these companies just aren't very interesting. Nonetheless, playing in Cuba now thanks to these companies is way better, and in a way, Cuba ends up winning out on this DLC in terms of content thanks to that. Despite Cuba not being centered much as part of this DLC, they got a huge boost in their fun factor now that their state is split in 3, and they have 3 really strong companies with some cool journals to boot. Let's talk now about what this update brings to the full game experience, as in this sense I am much more excited, but also a little bit worried for Victoria 3. So Infamy has been strongly rebalanced to take much more heavily into account the population of a state when deciding how much Infamy it costs to conquer. Now, as I said earlier, the bugs in this DLC mean that right now Infamy is not working as it's supposed to, but assuming that's fixed, which Connor and I have pushed Paradox to do for fear of immense community upset, then it's a good change. So I can't show it very well due to this issue. Basically, conquering low population states is now much cheaper, and therefore you won't have to waste like 5 Infamy on conquering a tiny state with no one in it. And especially against unrecognized nations will be much cheaper to conquer. This, in my opinion, is an excellent change, as it makes fighting other Europeans over African colonies feel much better, since if you have a split state with some tiny population in it, it won't cost you like 12 Infamy or something ridiculous to take it. That's one big change. Another one is the far more important one in my opinion. We now have 2 new domestic politics changes. First, we can negotiate with interest groups to get their support for laws they're neutral on, and second, we can add amendments to certain laws which modify how they work. Now, it needs to be said immediately that this is a very exciting change, but that it is currently very limited. New mechanics tend to be that way, and I'm hoping that in the future there will be more to this, but for now, a handful of laws have a handful of potential amendments, which can be granted via either negotiations or random events during law passes. There are a couple amendments that come from journal entries, like Spain's Regeneration Amendment, which gives a reduced interest rate to your economic law. More of this, please. I think it'll be received very well, and that will hopefully cue Paradox to do more of it. So if that's good, then what's the worry? Well, now we can negotiate with interest groups. That means passing laws is kind of a joke in most cases. Multiculturalism is easier than ever to pass, and it won't be nearly as hard to get through the politics of the game. Here's the thing though, I'm not too upset about that, you know? Ultimately, it's not really that fun to roll the dice on law passes and leaders and interest groups, so Paradox has taken an RNG mechanic and turned it into something with significantly more interesting choices to be made. Do I bribe my landowners? Do I give a long-term amendment that gives clout to an IG for a law? Do I spend a bunch of bureaucracy on a bribe? Do I promise to make universities? And so on and so forth. Right now, the options with regards to bribes are very small, but they're there, and they make politics very easy. I think this change will be well liked by pretty much everyone, but it will make the game a bit less, well, gamey. You won't need to exile interest group leaders and pray for the right one to pop up as often, albeit you absolutely still can do that and save scum to get the guy that you want. Personally, I think this is great because anything that turns RNG into actual gameplay is a positive if you ask me, at least in most cases. RNG can be exciting sometimes, but oftentimes Victoria 3's domestic politics can feel like literal gambling, and I think that's a bad thing. The negotiation mechanic helps it feel much better. Alongside these political changes, we have some new production methods for plantations, which make slavery a much more attractive law. I absolutely love these, since it's not just harsh treatment options, but you can also give your workers radios, or have people talk to them as they work. And personally, I feel like this is an option which will ultimately do very little to affect your economy, but let you express yourself a bit more with how you run your empire. This design philosophy should be applied to all the buildings if you ask me, as whether or not it meaningfully affects the meta or the strategy of the game as a whole, these options let me do something to be unique and distinguish my playthroughs. It also finally gives slavery, maybe, a chance to have a reason to exist. We'll have to see, as Generalist hasn't updated the spreadsheets yet, but maybe America will have more reason to pursue a slavery playthrough than just trolling at this point. An excellent change, and I hope that we see more of this, alongside more amendments, more negotiation options, and some more law variants. It's really nice to see the Victoria 3 team trying stuff out, putting things out there, not being afraid to, admittedly, undercook a feature with the idea of improving it later, or leaving it alone depending on the reception. Making a bit of a leap there, assuming that Paradox will continue to support these mechanics, but considering how agitators, political movements, and other small mechanics have developed over time, I think it's a safe bet. With this update also comes a new power block type, the Cultural Commonwealth, which is almost super amazing, and then it decides to limit itself for no reason. This power block lets you add your culture to nations within the block, and that's super cool. Much like how the religious block lets you make the Ottomans Catholic or other silly outcomes, this power block lets you make the Pope Spanish. Very nice. The problem is that they decided to make it so you can only do this to nations whose primary culture or cultures has or have something in common with yours. Womp womp, that means that for Romance-speaking cultures like Spanish, French, Italian, and so on, you can do a lot, but for less common languages, you can't do much with this block. So close, Paradox, so close. This choice is just an anti-fun choice, as it's not like being able to add your primary culture to another country really does much. All you're doing with this choice is stifling creativity, and it's a poor one. It'd be like if religious power blocks could only change religion of people that share the same religious group, so you can make Catholics Protestants and vice versa, but you couldn't make Muslims into Catholics. It's just not fun. What's the point? Otherwise, the shared canon mandate is crap, don't use it, and the power block doesn't come with any leader modifiers unlike the other power block types, meaning this is, objectively, the worst choice for power block type, but could have been the most fun if not for this anti-fun policy. Oh well. There's one last addition to the game with this patch and DLC, and that's that you can assign different rulers to countries on GameStar, such as making Karl Marx the King of Britain in 1836, with Victoria as his heir. This disables achievements and is ultimately a funny meme, and I can see it being fun to mess around with for sure. Having a communist king in Britain on GameStart will make passing certain laws much easier, and I think people will have a little bit of fun with this, but ultimately mostly leave it to the side. Nonetheless, I am happy to see it, and it is nice to have as a, what I can assume to be, relatively simple addition to the game which doesn't cause any harm. Cool. Beyond that, we have some map changes to South Africa, and well, I'll just say it, I don't care. I never play down there, and ultimately this has only changed how many wars it'll take for me to conquer the gold-rich land of South Africa. Paradox forgot to give guarantees to all the South African tags from Britain, by the way, so the old strategy of rushing down Oranje and Transvaal, or their new tags that replace them, is back on the menu. I'm pretty sure that's all the new stuff with this patch, but if I'm missing anything, then sorry about that. These are the big additions and the ones I think really matter. Let's conclude this review and give the DLC a score out of 10. It's always hard to judge a DLC whose content, when excluded from its accompanying free patch, is so just plain mid. I can't say I disliked anything in Iberian Twilight. It was all rather pleasant, but just could have been so much more. I keep on getting a feeling of, okay, that's done, now what? Only for the game to tell me that that was the end of the content. I enjoyed many of the concepts put on display here, and with just a little more sauce on the meal, this could have been gourmet. Instead, it's relatively satisfying as a staple restaurant. Inoffensive, reasonably priced, and you only find a hair in the food if you're really looking for it. What carries this DLC really is the new political mechanics it comes with on the free patch. I do rate the DLC and the free patch together just for simplicity's sake, and the stuff the free patch comes with is quite good, with just a handful of missteps here and there. In terms of bugs, I'm crossing my fingers that most of the really bad ones will be fixed for the December 11th release, given some of them are quite terrible, but I don't want to let what could just be an early access woe drag the score down too much, so I'm going to give Iberian Twilight a respectable 7.5 out of 10, and that's assuming that the major bugs I experienced are not present on release. If those bugs aren't fixed, it's more like a 6 out of 10, and if all the bugs, even the minor ones, are fixed, then we can bump that up to an 8, I'd say. This DLC is quite simply good, in my opinion, and fails to really capture me super strongly, but also fails to offend me in any harsh ways. I often felt the journals were a little too short and lacking depth, but I don't really care much for journals anyway. The DLC is instead carried by these new mechanics like negotiations, which change the game significantly. The actual Spain and Portugal content will be worth a playthrough or two, and then you can put it down and go play better nations using the new free mechanics. To elevate this DLC, I'd have liked to see certain journals like the United Kingdom of Brazil and Portugal go a little further beyond just establishing the Union. Although I like the reconquest of the old empire for Spain, it's rather anticlimactic to just get a modifier and call it a day. It'd be nice to then get journals about developing the colonies or something maybe, or perhaps a journal about annexing them. The same can be said for all the other journals for Portugal and Spain. Although it's a small thing, I'd have liked to see Basque or Catalan content akin to Bulgaria content from National Awakening. It wouldn't have to be anything huge, but just some lip service would be nice. My biggest gripe is the pointlessness of the new ideologies introduced in this DLC. Miguelists and Carlists are useless and only serve as RP value at most. The Cartists of Portugal are at least a pretty okay ideology with an interesting combo of supporting oligarchy and technocracy. Beyond that, yeah, it's fine. It really is the most inoffensive 7.5 out of 10 I think Victoria 3 has had so far. With that, I hope the review helped you decide on if you'll buy the DLC or not, and I'm looking forward to messing around with these new politics mechanics. Thanks to the channel members, and of course to all the viewers for listening to me yap, I really appreciate it. Thank you for your time.